Good evening. Tonight, we step into the harsh, the unknown, and the less honorable aspects of scientific breakthroughs. Leave behind the colorful patterns and peaceful vibes. What appears as a mind-expanding movement once carried the scent of clinical laboratories, icy suspicion, and tobacco haze in sealed chambers. The reality is, once you entered that realm, the hidden one behind the scenes, your own consciousness would have become the battlefield, and you likely wouldn't have realized you were fighting. So before you settle in, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate what I create here. And share in the comments where you're watching from and what hour it is where you are. It's always interesting to discover who's connecting with us from different corners of the globe. Device turned over, sound barely audible. Let's dive in. Our tale starts not in a burst of defiance, but in the silent, clinical accuracy of a research facility. In Basel, Switzerland, a town tucked into a zone of tranquility. While the outside world moved closer to conflict, a scientist named Albert Hofmann was performing his duties. He was a systematic individual working for the Sandoz pharmaceutical company, and his efforts in the late 1930s were respectable, though not groundbreaking. He was examining the ergot fungus, an unusual parasitic organism that attacked rye crops. For generations, ergot was recognized mainly as a toxin, the source of a terrible condition called St. Anthony's fire, which caused gangrene, seizures, and frightening visions. But inside this dark fungus, Hofmann was convinced existed medicinal potential. He was searching for a compound that might stimulate blood flow and breathing, a practical, marketable medication. He proceeded through a sequence of derivatives, methodically separating and creating each one. In 1938, he reached the 25th substance in the sequence. He labeled it with the simple, technical language of a researcher: lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD 25. He experimented with it on laboratory creatures. They grew restless. Their fur stood upright, but they displayed no other notable reactions. It was definitely not the circulation stimulant he was hoping to find. Hofmann recorded his observations, submitted his documentation, and like any competent researcher stepping away from a failed path, he stored the container of LSD 25 on a shelf. There it remained for 5 years, a forgotten molecule in a dusty section of a quiet laboratory, while beyond the borders of neutral Switzerland, the Second World War devoured the continent. History is filled with these silent intervals, these abandoned concepts awaiting their moment. Then on a spring day in 1943, something unexpected occurred. For a reason he could never completely clarify, not even to himself, Hofmann experienced an odd urge to revisit this unsuccessful experiment. He would later describe it as an unusual premonition, an instinct that contradicted his disciplined scientific thinking. Why return to a substance that had already demonstrated itself worthless? He couldn't explain, but on April 16th, he created a fresh batch of LSD 25. As he labored in the still sunlit laboratory, he started to feel unwell, not sick exactly, but unusual. An extraordinary dizziness washed over him, a feeling of changed perception that was deeply unsettling. He had to stop his work. He went home, reclined on his sofa, and shut his eyes. What occurred next was not slumber. It was, he recorded, a not unpleasant intoxicated-like condition marked by an exceptionally stimulated imagination. He witnessed a continuous stream of fantastic pictures, remarkable shapes, with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. After 2 hours, the visions disappeared. He was left with a deep sense of amazement and a persistent question. What had occurred? He was certain he had not consumed any of the substance. He was, as always, carefully cautious. He theorized that perhaps, just perhaps, he had absorbed a tiny trace amount through the skin of his fingertips. If that were accurate, if a dose too small to even observe could generate such powerful effects, then LSD 25 was a substance of nearly unimaginable potency, a phantom of a chemical. Being a man of science, he understood a hypothesis needed proof. A single accidental exposure was insufficient. He had to conduct a controlled experiment. So 3 days later, on the afternoon of April the 19th, he prepared for a journey. He decided to take what he considered to be the smallest dose that could possibly have an effect. He measured out 250 micrograms, a quarter of a milligram, a few grains of chemical dust barely visible. In the realm of pharmacology, it was a homeopathic dose, a whisper of a substance. He dissolved it in water and drank it. He could not possibly have known that he had just consumed what would later be considered a full, even heroic dose. For about 40 minutes, nothing occurred. He made a note in his journal. No effect. And then the world started to melt. The first signs were subtle. A creeping anxiety, distortions in his field of vision, profound sense of unreality. This was growing far more powerful, far more quickly than he had ever anticipated. Alarmed, he asked his laboratory assistant, a young woman named Susie, to accompany him home. But this was 1943. Basel was under wartime restrictions on motor vehicles. There was no company car, no taxi. There was only one way to get home, by bicycle. And so Albert Hofmann, the proper Swiss chemist, pedaled his way into history. The 4-mile ride through the streets of Basel became the world's first intentional acid trip. The familiar journey became a treacherous passage through a hostile landscape. The road before him seemed to ripple like a river. The buildings on either side breathed and warped, their facades undulating as if made of water. A neighbor, a kindly woman named Mrs. R., who greeted him on his return, transformed before his eyes into a malevolent, sinister witch with a colored mask. The fear was absolute. It was a cold, chemical terror. He was convinced he was losing his mind, that his ego, his very self, was dissolving into nothingness. He believed he was dying. Once inside his home, the trip intensified. The furniture swelled and twisted into grotesque, threatening shapes. The patterns on the floor swirled into bottomless vortexes. He asked Susie to call a doctor and to fetch some milk from the neighbor, the witch, believing it to be a universal antidote. The doctor arrived and could find nothing physically wrong with him. His heart rate was normal, his breathing steady. The only symptom was a pair of pupils so dilated they had almost swallowed his irises. As the doctor's calm presence reassured him that he was not, in fact, leaving the mortal coil, a profound shift occurred. The terror began to recede, and in its place bloomed an unparalleled sense of wonder. The fear gave way to a strange, detached joy. He closed his eyes and was met not with darkness, but with an explosion of geometric patterns, of ornate spiraling mandalas, of fountains of color. The sound of a passing car was not a noise, but a visual symphony. Every sound became a color, every color a feeling. For hours he was adrift in a universe of his own making, a passenger in his own consciousness. The next morning he woke up. The world was back in its proper place. The furniture was still, the street was solid, but everything was different. As he walked in his garden, he felt a sensation of rebirth. The dew on the leaves glittered with a profound sacred light. The birdsong was a hymn. The world was washed clean, shimmering with a beauty and significance he had never seen before. He knew then that he had not discovered a medicine for the circulatory system. He had stumbled upon a key to the mind itself. He had opened a door, and in the years that followed, the entire world would be invited to step through. In the quiet, methodical corridors of Sandoz, there was now a puzzle. They had a new compound, a substance of bewildering power, but it had no obvious commercial application. What exactly do you do with a chemical that makes you see God or a witch in your neighbor's face? They gave it the trade name Delicid, and with a great deal of Swiss caution, they began to offer it free of charge to a select group of psychiatric institutions and researchers. The accompanying literature suggested its use in two ways. First, that a psychiatrist could take it themselves to experience for a few hours what it might be like to inhabit the world of a schizophrenic patient. And second, that it could be used in psychotherapy to help bring repressed material to the surface. It was sent out into the world not as a drug, but as a tool for exploration, a strange key offered to those who studied locks. The response from the psychiatric community of the 1950s was not one of fear, but of profound, almost breathless excitement. This was a golden age of psychoanalysis, an era dominated by the ideas of Freud and Jung, a time when the subconscious was seen as a vast hidden continent within every individual, and here was a chemical that seemed to be a map. The initial theory was that LSD was a psychotomimetic, a substance that mimicked psychosis. Researchers believed that by inducing a temporary controllable madness, they could finally understand the mechanics of schizophrenia. But this theory soon gave way to a much grander, more optimistic vision. This wasn't a key to madness. It was a key to healing. Therapists discovered that under the influence of the drug, the rigid defenses of the ego, the very structures that kept painful memories buried, would soften and dissolve. Patients could suddenly access and confront deep-seated traumas with a clarity and emotional honesty that might have taken years, even decades of traditional talk therapy to achieve. It was like a chemical bulldozer for the psyche, clearing away the scar tissue of the past in a single powerful session. For a time, it was hailed as a wonder drug, potential penicillin for the soul. From clinics in Europe to research hospitals in North America, the experiments began. Two main schools of thought emerged. In Europe, the preferred method was psycholytic therapy. This involved giving patients a series of low doses of LSD over many sessions, intended to gently lyse or dissolve neurotic blockades, like a slow-acting solvent on psychic rust. But in the United States and Canada, a bolder approach took hold: psychedelic therapy. The term itself was coined in a letter between two of the field's pioneers. The psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond wrote to the author Aldous Huxley, who had just taken mescaline under his supervision. "To fathom hell or soar angelic," Osmond wrote, "just take a pinch of psychedelic." It meant quite literally mind manifesting. This approach centered on a single overwhelming experience. A patient would be given one large dose in a carefully controlled supportive setting with the explicit goal of inducing a mystical or transcendent state. An experience so profound it could completely reorder their personality and worldview. In the vast flat plains of Saskatchewan, Canada, Dr. Osmond was achieving results that were nothing short of miraculous. He was working with chronic, hopeless alcoholics, men who had failed every other form of treatment. He gave them LSD, and in a single session, a staggering 50% of them stopped drinking for good. They didn't just get sober, they were transformed. They reported profound spiritual awakenings, a sense of cosmic connection that erased their desire for alcohol. One of Osmond's most famous subjects was Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Wilson took LSD in 1956 and experienced a state he said was akin to the spiritual awakening that had founded the AA movement itself. He became convinced that LSD could help other alcoholics find the spiritual experience that was the cornerstone of his 12 steps. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, the cool, cautious Dr. Sidney Cohen was conducting his own studies at UCLA. He administered the drug not to the mentally ill, but to the cultural elite, to artists, writers, philosophers, and scientists, to study its effects on creativity and consciousness. It was Cohen who famously guided Aldous Huxley through his first mescaline experience, which Huxley chronicled in his seminal book, The Doors of Perception. The book, published in 1954, was the first mainstream introduction for the educated public to the world of psychedelics. It framed the experience not as a descent into madness, but as an ascent into a higher form of reality, a cleansing of the mind's perceptual filters. Suddenly, this obscure research chemical was a subject of intense intellectual curiosity, and in the celebrity-obsessed culture of Southern California, it became a kind of status symbol. The actor Cary Grant famously underwent over 100 LSD sessions with his therapist. He credited the drug with saving his life, with helping him confront his childhood traumas and finally find inner peace. He was its most vocal public advocate, declaring to magazines that he had been born again. This was the strange, forgotten chapter of LSD's history. Before Haight-Ashbury, before Timothy Leary told a generation to turn on, tune in, drop out, LSD was a serious, legitimate tool of the establishment. It was explored in the halls of academia, administered in hospitals, and discussed in the most respected intellectual circles. Between 1950 and 1965, more than 1,000 scientific papers were published, and some 40,000 patients were treated with psychedelic therapy for conditions ranging from depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder to schizophrenia, and the existential dread of terminal cancer patients. For a brief shining decade, it seemed that Albert Hofmann's strange accidental discovery was on the verge of revolutionizing our understanding of the human mind. It was a miracle cure, a key to consciousness itself, but that very same key, that very same power to dissolve the ego and reshape reality, was beginning to attract the attention of a very different group of people. They weren't interested in healing minds, they were interested in breaking them. While therapists in sunlit California offices were exploring the consciousness-expanding properties of LSD, a deep glacial paranoia was settling in over Washington, D.C. The world had split in two. The Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, a stark line drawn between two irreconcilable ideologies. The Soviet Union had the bomb. China had fallen to the communists. The Cold War was not a war of armies and battlefields, but a shadow war of ideology, of subversion, of secrets. It was a war for the future of humanity. And at the heart of it was a terrifying new fear. A war for the mind itself. The flashpoint came not in the capitals of Europe, but on the frozen, war-torn peninsula of Korea. Something deeply disturbing began to happen. When some of these prisoners were released or repatriated, they were not the same men who'd been captured. They were hollowed out, compliant. They appeared on camera and calmly confessed to horrific, fabricated war crimes, accusing the United States of waging germ warfare. They signed petitions and delivered radio addresses praising their captors and denouncing American imperialism. One of the most shocking cases was that of Colonel Frank Schwabel, a highly decorated Marine Corps aviator. After months of interrogation, he signed a detailed 60-page confession admitting to dropping bacteriological bombs. The American public was horrified. The military was humiliated. How could these hardened soldiers, these American heroes, be turned against their own country? A new word entered the American vocabulary, a word that perfectly captured this insidious, invisible threat: brainwashing. It was coined by a journalist named Edward Hunter, who was also, not coincidentally, a CIA propaganda operative. He was translating the Chinese term "shi nao," which literally means to wash the brain. The term was electric. It conjured images of a terrifyingly sophisticated psychological technology, a secret communist science that could systematically dismantle a man's beliefs, erase his identity, and install a new one, as if programming a machine. The media ran with it. Sensationalist articles and movies depicted American GIs being subjected to mysterious drugs, hypnosis, and relentless psychological torture until their free will simply evaporated. The brainwashing bogeyman became a central figure in the nightmare landscape of the Cold War. Inside the fledgling Central Intelligence Agency, this was not seen as hysteria. It was seen as an existential threat. The director of Central Intelligence, Alan Dulles, was a patrician, pipe-smoking spy master, a veteran of the OSS in World War II. He was not a man given to panic, but the POW situation in Korea deeply disturbed him. He had seen the Soviet show trials in the 30s, where loyal old guard Bolsheviks stood up and confessed to being lifelong traitors and spies for foreign powers. He saw the same pattern repeating with American soldiers. To Dulles and the men around him, the conclusion was inescapable and terrifying. The communists possessed a secret weapon, a technology of mind control that could turn any man into a puppet, and the United States had nothing to counter it. The logic that followed was cold, brutal, and, in the context of the time, perfectly rational to the men in charge of national security. If the enemy has a weapon that you don't, you have two urgent priorities. First, you must develop a defense against it, and second, you must develop a better version of that same weapon for yourself. The search for a mind control substance became one of the CIA's most secret and urgent crusades. The agency began a vast clandestine research program, throwing money at any and every possible avenue. They funded research into hypnosis, electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, and esoteric poisons. They scoured the globe for exotic plants and folk remedies used by indigenous tribes to induce trance states. They needed a chemical that could unlock a man's secrets, a truth serum. But they also dreamed of something more. They wanted a substance that could break a person's will, shatter their sense of self, and make them pliable, suggestible, a blank slate upon which a new identity could be written. And then, their search led them to Basel, Switzerland. Reports began to filter through the intelligence community about LSD, the experimental compound from Sandoz Pharmaceuticals. The scientific papers described a substance of almost unbelievable power. A microscopic dose, tasteless and odorless, could be administered without a person's knowledge. It could induce a state of profound psychological disorientation, dissolving the ego and blurring the lines between reality and hallucination. It could make a person intensely vulnerable and open to suggestion. To the therapists in their clinics, this was a tool for healing, for accessing the deepest truths of the self. To Alan Dulles and the security analysts at the CIA, it sounded like the perfect weapon. It was the skeleton key they had been searching for. The psychiatric miracle was about to be weaponized. The quest for enlightenment was about to take a very, very dark turn into a secret war for control of the human mind. The stage was set for a project of unimaginable scope and moral abandon, a project that would soon be given a code name, MK Ultra. In the quiet, humming corridors of the Central Intelligence Agency, a new kind of war was being contemplated. A war not for territory, but for the territory of the mind itself. And for such a war, you need a very particular kind of weapons master. He arrived in 1951, a man of profound contradictions. His name was Sidney Gottlieb. Though he had been born Joseph Scheider, he was a brilliant chemist holding a doctorate from the California Institute of Technology. He was also a man who walked with a pronounced limp, a result of a clubfoot, and spoke with a persistent stutter, insecurities that perhaps fueled a quiet, ferocious ambition. To those who knew him superficially, he was a gentle, saintly soul. He lived on a rustic farm in Virginia, practiced folk dancing, grew organic vegetables, and insisted on drinking unpasteurized milk from his own goats, a peculiar health regimen that would nearly kill him more than once. But within the clandestine world of the agency, he had another identity. They called him the Black Sorcerer. Gottlieb was given a mission of almost mythical proportions by director Alan Dulles, a man who saw the Cold War as a contest of absolute moralities played out with utterly immoral tools. The mission, born from the fevered paranoia of the era, from tales of American prisoners of war in Korea confessing to crimes they did not commit, was to find a key that could unlock and rewrite human consciousness. Dulles wanted a truth serum, yes, but he also wanted so much more. He wanted a substance that could make a captured agent forget everything he knew, a drug that could discredit a foreign leader by making him behave erratically in public, a chemical that could induce dependency, create programmable assassins, or simply shatter a mind beyond repair. It was a quest for the holy grail of espionage, total control. To achieve this, Dulles gave Gottlieb a charter of terrifying scope. In April of 1953, Project MK Ultra was born. It was a program so secret that very few people in the agency even knew of its existence. Gottlieb was given a budget of $300,000, a pittance by today's standards, but a fortune then. And most importantly, he was granted a waiver from all normal government contracting and accounting procedures. He was authorized, in writing, to conduct experiments on unwitting American citizens. The memo gave him carte blanche to explore any avenue, any substance, any method, as long as it did not result in a fatality, a rule that would prove tragically flexible. Gottlieb became the CIA's alchemist, the head of the technical services staff, a Q branch from a nightmare. He didn't just seek out existing drugs, he sought to weaponize them. His team synthesized botulinum toxin, created deadly poisons hidden in fountain pens and cigars, and developed exotic biological agents intended for political assassinations. He traveled the world under a series of bland aliases, a quiet man in a rumpled suit, visiting CIA stations and foreign contacts, always hunting for something new. He procured psychoactive mushrooms from Mexican healers, datura and henbane from arcane sources, and studied ancient poisons from the Amazon. He built a vast pharmacological arsenal, but from the very beginning, one compound stood out. It was a substance of such strange and profound power that it seemed to promise everything the agency desired. Lysergic acid diethylamide 25. LSD. Gottlieb, a man of science, saw in its molecular structure not a key to spiritual enlightenment, but a tool of immense strategic potential. The drug, he theorized, could create a temporary, controllable psychosis. It could dissolve the ego, that stubborn fortress of individual will, leaving the mind exposed and vulnerable, ready to be interrogated, manipulated, or rebuilt from the ground up. This was the hypothesis, and Sidney Gottlieb, the quiet farmer with a stutter, was about to unleash a search for proof that would spread like a chemical contagion through the darkest corners of American society, looking for test subjects who would never know they were part of an experiment. He began by testing the drug on his own colleagues within the agency, often with a casual, almost sociopathic lack of warning. A dose in the morning coffee became a running, if terrifying, joke among the chemists of the technical services staff. But to truly understand the weapon, Gottlieb knew he needed a much larger, more varied pool of subjects. He needed to take the laboratory to the streets. The man the agency chose to run its street-level experiments was, in many ways, Sidney Gottlieb's perfect opposite. George Hunter White was not a scientist. He was a brusque, hard-drinking, larger-than-life federal narcotics agent. A veteran of the OSS during World War II, a man who moved through the criminal underworld with a swaggering confidence. Where Gottlieb was cerebral and secretive, White was visceral and loud. He was a man who enjoyed the dirtier aspects of his work, perhaps a little too much. In 1953, Gottlieb approached White, bringing him into the MK Ultra fold and giving him one of the program's most infamous and sordid assignments. The agency would fund the creation of a network of safe houses, but these were not for debriefing spies or hiding defectors. They were to be observation posts, laboratories disguised as living rooms and bedrooms, where the primary experiment was the clandestine administration of LSD to unsuspecting American men. The project was given a name that dripped with the pulp fiction melodrama of the era, Operation Midnight Climax. The first safe house was established in New York's Greenwich Village, at 81 Bedford Street, a 4-story walk-up in a neighborhood known for its artists, bohemians and discreet hideaways. Later, a more elaborate and notorious operation was set up in San Francisco at 225 Chestnut Street, a handsome apartment on Telegraph Hill with a sweeping view of the bay. The CIA, through front corporations, leased the properties and spared no expense in outfitting them for their grim purpose. George White, a man with a flair for the theatrical, decorated the interiors himself. The style was a deliberate caricature of a French brothel, complete with Toulouse-Lautrec prints on the walls, velvet curtains and photos of can-can dancers in suggestive poses. The decor was meant to be slightly disorienting, to contribute to the subject's sense of unreality once the drug began to take hold. The centerpiece of the design, however, was not the art or the furniture. It was the two-way mirror. Behind the glass, in a hidden observation room, a CIA agent would sit with a notepad and a whirring reel-to-reel tape recorder. The room was equipped with its own private toilet and a well-stocked bar, allowing the observers to remain at their posts for hours, a quiet audience to the chemically induced psychodramas unfolding just a few feet away. The logistics of the operation were cold and efficient. The agency hired prostitutes, placing them on the federal payroll. These women were the bait. They were instructed to go out to bars and find men, sailors on shore leave, businessmen on a trip, tourists, anyone who seemed unlikely to have powerful connections or a reason to go to the police. They would lure the man back to the apartment with the promise of a drink and companionship. Once inside, the woman would signal the agent behind the mirror, often by a subtle gesture or a code word. The agent would then watch as she prepared a highball or a cocktail, nonchalantly adding a dose of clear, odorless, tasteless liquid from a small vial. The dosage was entirely experimental. Sometimes it was a small amount, perhaps 50 micrograms. Other times it was a massive, overwhelming dose. The subject, the John, would have no idea that his evening was about to take a very strange turn. From behind the glass, the agents observed and took meticulous notes. George White, often personally overseeing the San Francisco operation, would sit in the dark, a drink in his hand, scribbling his observations in a diary. His entries were a bizarre mix of clinical detachment and vulgar commentary. He logged the subject's reactions as the LSD began to warp their perception of time, space, and self. The agents were not looking for spiritual insights. They were looking for weakness. They watched to see if the men would lose their inhibitions, if they would babble incoherently, or most hopefully, if they would divulge secrets. They wanted to know if a man, his ego dissolved by acid, would confess to affairs, to crimes, or to his deepest fears. The results were, from the CIA's perspective, profoundly disappointing. The men rarely revealed anything of intelligence value. Instead, they would often become intensely paranoid, convinced that the CIA was trying to read their minds, a paranoia that was, ironically, entirely justified. Some would stare at their hands for an hour, mesmerized. Others would become terrified by the shifting patterns on the wallpaper or the face of the prostitute, which might suddenly appear demonic or alien. Some would simply become confused and despondent. The data collected was a chaotic mess of psychological distress, not a neat transcript of extracted secrets. The project was a failure in its stated goal of developing an effective interrogation technique. Yet for over a decade, from the early 50s until the mid-60s, the lights stayed on at 225 Chestnut Street and 81 Bedford Street. The CIA continued to pour money into the project, paying the rent, the prostitutes' salaries, and George White's generous expense account, which included line items for liquor, tape recorders, and surreptitious entry tools. The entire operation was a surreal and deeply cynical parody of American life. The nation's premier intelligence agency, tasked with defending the country from the threat of godless communism, was operating a state-sponsored brothel on American soil, drugging its own citizens without their consent, and violating every conceivable civil liberty it was sworn to protect. George White himself seemed to understand the grotesque absurdity of it all. "I was a very minor missionary. Actually," he would later write with a note of dark, self-aggrandizing humor, "not a preacher, but a sinner who, at least, tried to move in the right direction." The direction, however, was a long, slow descent into a moral abyss, and the unsuspecting men who stumbled out of those apartments into the disorienting night were just the first casualties. They were the visible tip of an iceberg of human experimentation, so vast and so cold that its full dimensions would not be understood for decades. The brothels in New York and San Francisco, for all their sordid theatrics, represented only one small, almost boutique corner of Sidney Gottlieb's sprawling empire of non-consensual research. Operation Midnight Climax was just one of 149 distinct sub-projects funded under the MK Ultra umbrella. Gottlieb's quest for a mind control weapon was not confined to a few apartments. It had infiltrated the nation's most secure and vulnerable institutions, from its prisons to its mental hospitals. He had constructed a secret nationwide network of researchers, psychologists, chemists, and doctors at prestigious universities and hospitals who were willing to conduct high-risk experiments on human beings in exchange for generous, no questions asked funding from CIA-front organizations like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. The subjects of these experiments were chosen precisely because they had no power, no voice, and no one to speak for them. They were the forgotten and the confined, the perfect human guinea pigs. One of the most harrowing research sites was the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky. It was a federal prison primarily housing inmates incarcerated for narcotics offenses. Here, the CIA, through a researcher named Harris Isbell, conducted a series of brutal LSD studies on a captive population of African American prisoners. The arrangement was a model of cynical exploitation. Inmates were offered a powerful incentive to volunteer for the experiments, drugs. If they agreed to be a subject, they would be rewarded with injections of high-quality heroin or morphine, a cruel bargain for men battling addiction. In one particularly notorious study, 7 men were kept on a continuous LSD trip for 77 consecutive days. They were given triple the normal recreational dose every single day for over 2 months. The goal was to see if the drug could be used to break a person down, to induce a state of permanent confusion or dependency. The subjects suffered from terrifying hallucinations, psychosis, and severe psychological distress, all dutifully recorded in Dr. Isbell's research notes, which were then passed along to his sponsors at the CIA. The prisoners of Lexington were ideal subjects because their reality was already circumscribed by bars and guards. Their complaints, if they made any, would echo only within the prison walls and then fade away. The search for vulnerable minds also led MK Ultra north, across the Canadian border to the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University in Montreal. There, a highly respected psychiatrist named Ewan, Cameron was pioneering a series of radical and brutal techniques he called psychic driving and depatterning. Dr. Cameron believed that he could cure mental illness, from schizophrenia to anxiety, by completely erasing a patient's existing personality and then rebuilding a new one from scratch. With funding secretly funneled from the CIA, he turned his theories into a horrifying reality. Patients, many of whom had checked into the institute for mild conditions like postpartum depression or anxiety, were subjected to an unimaginable regimen. They were put into drug-induced comas for weeks, sometimes months at a time. They were given massive rounds of electroshock therapy, sometimes 30 to 40 times the normal dosage. And while they were in this helpless, sedated state, they were dosed with huge quantities of LSD and other psychoactive drugs, while a speaker placed under their pillow played a looped tape of simple, repetitive commands or random noise for 24 hours a day. The intent was to shatter their memories, their sense of self, their entire mental landscape. The results were catastrophic. Hundreds of patients left the Allen Memorial Institute as empty shells, their memories gone, their intellects diminished, reduced to an almost infantile state. unable to recognize their own families. Dr. Cameron's work was not a cure. It was a form of psychological demolition, funded and encouraged by Sidney Gottlieb, who saw in this brutal depatterning a potential blueprint for breaking down a captured enemy agent. But the circle of experimentation was not limited to prisoners and patients. In his quest to understand the effects of LSD, Gottlieb believed it was essential to test the drug on his own people. A strange and reckless culture of surprise dosing took root within the CIA's technical services, staff, and among its partners in the Army's Chemical Warfare Division. Agents would slip LSD into each other's drinks at office parties or morning meetings, treating the profound psychic disruption of the drug as a kind of practical joke. It was seen as a macho rite of passage, a way to prove you could handle the tools of your trade. Most of the victims of these internal acid tests would experience a few terrifying hours of confusion and paranoia before returning, shaken to their desks. But in the autumn of 1953, this casual cruelty would have a final, fatal consequence. The man at the center of the tragedy was named Frank Olson. He was not a spy or a hardened field operative. He was a brilliant 43-year-old bacteriologist working for the Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick in Maryland, a top-secret facility dedicated to biological warfare research. Olson was a deeply principled man, a devoted husband and father of 3, who was beginning to have profound moral doubts about the nature of his work. In November 1953, Olson and a group of his colleagues from Fort Detrick joined several top CIA officials, including Sidney Gottlieb and his deputy Robert Lashbrook, for a research retreat at a remote cabin on Deep Creek Lake in rural Maryland. Over 3 days, they discussed their top-secret joint projects. On the evening of the second day, Gottlieb decided, without warning or consent, to conduct another of his informal experiments. After dinner, as the men sat around talking, Gottlieb laced a bottle of Cointreau, a French liqueur, with LSD. He watched quietly as several of the men, including Frank Olson, poured themselves a glass. For most of the men, the effects were manageable, but Olson's reaction was different. He did not have a pleasant or insightful experience. The drug seemed to unlock a deep well of anxiety and paranoia within him. He became quiet, withdrawn, and intensely disturbed. The world, which had seemed orderly and rational just hours before, now felt threatening and unstable. In the days that followed, his condition worsened. He told his boss that he was quitting, that he had made a terrible mistake with his life and his career. He was consumed by guilt and fear. The CIA, realizing they had a serious problem on their hands, became concerned, not for Olson's well-being, but for the secrets he held. They worried he might become a security risk. Instead of getting him proper medical care, they decided to handle it internally. They sent him to New York City, escorted by Robert Lashbrook, for a psychiatric evaluation with a doctor who was also on the CIA payroll. The trip only deepened Olson's paranoia. He felt he was being watched, that his mind had been permanently damaged. On the night of November the 27th, Olson and Lashbrook checked into the Hotel Statler in Midtown Manhattan. They were given room 1018A. In the early hours of the next morning, around 2:30 a.m., something happened in that room. The hotel's night manager received a phone call from a frantic Lashbrook, saying his roommate had jumped from the window. Down on the pavement of 7th Avenue, the body of Frank Olson lay broken. He had fallen 10 stories, crashing through the closed and latched window of his room. The official story, fed to his grieving family and the press, was simple and clean. Frank Olson had suffered a severe nervous breakdown and had committed suicide. For 22 years, his family believed that lie. The word LSD was never mentioned. The truth only began to surface in the 1970s, with the revelations of the Rockefeller Commission, which was investigating CIA abuses. The agency was forced to admit that it had drugged Olson 9 days before his death, but the admission only deepened the mystery. Was it truly a suicide, a tragic but direct result of a drug-induced psychosis, or was it something more sinister? Had Olson, in his agitated state, threatened to expose the CIA's darkest secrets? Not just MK-Ultra, but the biological weapons programs he worked on at Fort Detrick. Did the man escorting him, Lashbrook, decide that a distraught bacteriologist was a liability the agency could not afford? Was he pushed? We will never know for sure. The only other person in that room, Robert Lashbrook, told a story filled with inconsistencies. Frank Olson's death became the program's first officially acknowledged fatality, a single stark gravestone in the vast unmarked cemetery of MK Ultra's victims. It was the moment the Black Sorcerer's abstract quest for control collided with the fragile, unpredictable, and ultimately tragic reality of a single human life. While the men in grey suits at Langley and Fort Detrick were busy trying to weaponize consciousness, the subject of their research was quietly beginning to change hands. A secret cannot be studied without being shared, and a substance with the power to dissolve the very architecture of the self has a way of developing its own agenda. The locks on the laboratory doors were strong, but the idea they contained was stronger. The genie, as they say, was beginning to stir within its clinical bottle, sensing the porous nature of the world outside. Its first true escape was not an explosion, but a quiet conversation, a shared cup of tea in a modest California home. It happened on a sunny afternoon in May of 1953. In the Hollywood Hills, the host was the celebrated British author Aldous Huxley, a man whose mind was already a grand cathedral of literature, philosophy, and esoteric thought. His guest was Dr. Humphrey Osmond, a British psychiatrist working in Saskatchewan, Canada, a pioneer in using psychedelics to treat alcoholism. Osmond was the one who brought the gift, a small crystalline dose of mescaline, the active alkaloid in the peyote cactus. Huxley, the author of Brave New World, a novel that envisioned a society pacified by a state-controlled drug, was about to willingly explore a substance that promised not pacification, but liberation. He swallowed the capsule and waited. What followed was not a hallucination in the lurid popular sense. He saw no dragons, no swirling vortexes. Instead, the world simply revealed itself. He sat in his study and stared at a small vase of flowers. They were no longer just flowers. They were, in his words, what Adam had seen on the morning of his creation, the miracle, moment by moment, of naked existence. The intricate folds of his trousers became a universe of infinite complexity, a rhythm of light and shadow, as profound as a Baroque masterpiece. Time slowed to a geological pace. The ego, that tireless chattering narrator in his head, fell silent. He experienced the world not as an observer but as a participant, a seamless part of the isness of reality. This serene, intellectual, and profoundly spiritual experience formed the basis of his slim but earth-shattering book, The Doors of Perception, published the following year. The title, borrowed from the poet William Blake, became a signpost for a generation. The book did something the CIA's internal reports never could. It gave the psychedelic experience a vocabulary, a philosophy, a dignity. It framed it not as a tool for interrogation or a symptom of psychosis, but as a valid mode of spiritual inquiry, a gratuitous grace in a world growing increasingly grey and materialistic. Huxley's careful, eloquent prose was the key that unlocked the substance from the domain of medicine and espionage and placed it into the hands of artists, thinkers, and seekers. But an idea, even a brilliant one, needs a network. It needs a missionary. While Huxley provided the sacred text, the substance found its most effective and enigmatic apostle in a man named Al Hubbard. Captain Al Hubbard. The title was honorary, his past shrouded in a fog of whispers and conflicting tales. He was said to have been an OSS officer during the war, a rum runner, a brilliant physicist, a uranium millionaire. Whatever his history, by the 1950s, Hubbard was a portly, jovial man with a deep, unwavering conviction. LSD was nothing less than a sacrament, a tool for humanity's salvation, and he believed it was his personal mission to deliver it. He was the Johnny Appleseed of lysergic acid diethylamide. Hubbard's method was a masterclass in strategic dissemination. He wasn't a street dealer. He was a curator of enlightenment for the elite. Using his considerable wealth and connections, he obtained a legal, permanent license from Sandoz Pharmaceuticals to procure LSD-25 for his own research. His lab was wherever he happened to be. He traveled the world with a leather doctor's bag containing pharmaceutically pure LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline. His strategy was simple and devastatingly effective. He targeted the top of the pyramid. He believed that if you could change the minds of the people who ran the world itself would change. He introduced LSD to executives in boardrooms, to priests in their rectories, to politicians in quiet private settings. He guided a vice president of Bell and Howell, a Monsignor of the Catholic Church in Vancouver, and countless other influential figures. His sessions were calm, controlled and often luxurious affairs, a far cry from the cold clinical settings of the CIA. He would sit with his subject, a reassuring, grandfatherly presence, and gently guide them through the dissolution of their own ego. He claimed to have personally guided over 6,000 people on their first psychedelic journey. He built a quiet, invisible network of enlightened power brokers, a secret society whose initiation rite was a few hundred micrograms of a psychoactive chemical. While the CIA was trying to force the genie into the service of the state, Al Hubbard was personally uncorking the bottle in the halls of power, one mind at a time, letting the vapor seep into the very foundations of the establishment. The quiet work of these two men, the thinker and the evangelist, ensured that when the 1960s began to dawn, LSD was no longer just a chemical compound. It was an idea, a promise, a rumor of transcendence, waiting for a new kind of profit. That profit would emerge not from the world of espionage or high finance, but from the hallowed halls of academia. He was a charismatic, ambitious, and deeply unconventional psychology lecturer at Harvard University. His name was Timothy Leary. In the summer of 1960, long before he was a household name, Leary was on vacation in Cuernavaca, Mexico. There, a local anthropologist introduced him to something the indigenous people had known for centuries, the teonanacatl, the so-called magic mushroom. Sitting by a swimming pool, Leary consumed the fungi. The experience shattered him. He later wrote that he learned more about the human mind in those 5 hours than he had in 15 years as a professional psychologist. He felt he had died and been reborn, seeing the universe as a cellular dance of energy, his own ego a temporary, amusing illusion. He returned to Harvard a changed man. The staid world of behavioral psychology, with its lab rats and statistical charts, now seemed like a child's game. He had, he believed, found the key to unlocking human potential, and it grew out of the ground. Back in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he found an eager collaborator in his younger, more earnest colleague Richard Alpert. Together, in 1960, they founded the Harvard Psilocybin Project. At first, their work was academically rigorous, or at least it appeared to be. They wanted to study the effects of psilocybin on human consciousness in a controlled scientific manner. One of their most famous studies was the Concord Prison Experiment, which ran from 1961 to 1963. They administered psilocybin to a group of inmates, hoping the profound experience would engender empathy and reduce the likelihood of them reoffending upon release. The initial results seemed astonishingly positive, though later analysis would call the methodology into serious question. Another key study was the Marsh Chapel Experiment, also known as the Good Friday Experiment. They gave psilocybin to a group of graduate divinity students just before a Good Friday service, to see if the chemical could reliably induce a genuine religious experience. The majority of the subjects reported profound mystical states, feeling a sense of unity, transcendence, and sacredness that they described as one of the most significant moments of their lives. But the line between researcher and subject, between observer and participant, was beginning to blur. Leary and Alpert began taking the substances along with their research subjects, abandoning clinical detachment for shared exploration. The sessions became less like experiments and more like psychedelic salons, filled with beat poets like Allen Ginsberg and a rotating cast of graduate students and intellectual thrill-seekers. Rumors began to swirl through the staid, ivy-covered campus, stories of chaotic drug parties, of undergraduates being dosed, of a cult of personality forming around the charming, silver-tongued Leary. The university administration grew increasingly alarmed. The project was becoming a source of scandal. The final straw came in the spring of 1963. Richard Alpert was fired for giving psilocybin to an undergraduate student, a clear violation of their agreement with the university. A short time later, Timothy Leary was also dismissed, officially for failing to show up to teach his scheduled classes. He had been, in his own mind, busy with more important work. The firing was not a defeat for Leary, it was a liberation. Freed from the constraints of academia, he and Alpert fully embraced their new roles as psychedelic pioneers. They were bankrolled by Peggy Hitchcock and Tommy Hitchcock, the young adventurous heirs to the Mellon fortune. The Hitchcock siblings bought a rambling 64-room mansion on a sprawling estate in Millbrook, New York. This estate became the new headquarters, a communal experiment and the epicenter of the psychedelic movement on the East Coast. Millbrook was part research centre, part spiritual commune, part non-stop house party. Here, Leary, Alpert, and a core group of followers dedicated themselves to the systematic exploration of consciousness using LSD, which was more potent and readily available than psilocybin. They wrote manifestos, developed guides for navigating the psychedelic trip, and attempted to create a new way of living based on ego loss and expanded awareness. It was during this period that Leary, now fully transformed from professor to prophet, began to publicly advocate for mass psychedelic use. He held press conferences and gave lectures, his rhetoric growing more and more messianic. In '66, he uttered the three phrases that would become the motto of a generation, a line that would be plastered on posters, printed on buttons, and whispered in dorm rooms across the country. Turn on, tune in, drop out. To Leary, the phrase was a carefully sequenced instruction manual. Turn on meant activating your neural equipment, going within to discover a new level of consciousness, preferably with the aid of a psychedelic. Tune in meant interacting harmoniously with the world around you, expressing your newly discovered perspective. Drop out was the most controversial part. He didn't mean to simply become a lazy bum. He meant a conscious, deliberate, and selective detachment from the involuntary and unconscious commitments of mainstream society, the corporate job, the political games, the consumerist rat race. It was a call for internal secession, but to the media and to a panicked establishment, it sounded like a call for social anarchy, an invitation for America's youth to abandon their responsibilities and disappear into a haze of drug-fueled navel-gazing. Timothy Leary, the former Harvard academic, was now recast as the most dangerous man in America, a title bestowed upon him by President Richard Nixon. He had taken the genie that escaped from the lab and the intellectual salon, and he had broadcast its message to the entire world. The bottle was now completely shattered, and a new, wilder phase was about to begin on the other side of the country. While Timothy Leary was holding court on his pastoral estate in Millbrook, building a new psychedelic religion from the top down, a different kind of energy was brewing on the West Coast. It was less philosophical and more chaotic, less intellectual and more primal. It was driven not by a professor, but by a novelist, a wrestler, a man who straddled the worlds of the Beat generation and the nascent hippie movement. His name was Ken Kesey. Fresh off the enormous success of his '62 novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Kesey was already a literary star. But his most formative experience hadn't happened at a writer's desk. It had happened in a hospital. In 1959, as a creative writing student at Stanford University, Kesey had volunteered for a medical study at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital. He was paid $20 a day to take a variety of psychoactive drugs and report on their effects. The study, he would later learn, was secretly funded by the CIA as part of its MK Ultra program. In a moment of supreme historical irony, the CIA's search for a mind control weapon directly created one of the counterculture's most influential figures. It was there, in a government-funded experiment, that Ken Kesey first took LSD. For him, the experience was not a quiet spiritual unfolding, but a full-blown carnival for the senses, a hilarious and terrifying glimpse behind the flimsy curtain of consensus reality. He didn't just see the light, he wanted to play with the switchboard. Kesey soon began acquiring his own supply of LSD, sharing it with his bohemian friends from the Perry Lane community near Stanford. This group of writers, artists, and beautiful misfits would form the core of his legendary crew, the Merry Pranksters. Their most famous member was the driver, the living embodiment of the Beat spirit, Neil Cassidy, the man who had been the inspiration for Dean Moriarty in Jack Kerouac's On the Road. Cassidy was the high-energy, fast-talking, benzodrine-fueled bridge between two generations of American rebellion. In the summer of 1964, Kesey and the Pranksters decided to embark on a new kind of American road trip. They purchased a 1939 International Harvester school bus, a lumbering ancient machine that they transformed into a rolling work of art and a mobile sound studio. They painted it in dizzying day-glow swirls of primary color, installed a complex system of microphones and speakers inside and out, and cut a hole in the roof so they could sit up top and play music to the bewildered citizens of the towns they passed through. They christened the bus Further. Their destination was the New York World's Fair, but their true goal was far more abstract: to create a movie, to live a movie, and to turn America itself into a grand psychedelic stage. With Cassidy at the wheel, fueled by a seemingly endless supply of amphetamines and a cooler full of orange juice laced with LSD, they set off on a journey that would become the stuff of legend. They were a traveling disruption, a living, breathing art installation aimed at jolting America out of its black and white slumber. When they returned to California, the mission evolved. The road trip had been for themselves. Now they wanted to share the experience with everyone. They began hosting a series of parties, but party is too small a word for what they created. They called them the acid tests. The first was held at a ranch in Sordid, California in November 1965. The concept was to create a total environment where one could have an LSD experience without any particular guidance or goal, a space for unstructured play. The pranksters were not gurus like Leary. They were masters of ceremonies, cosmic clowns, orchestrating a multi-sensory overload. An acid test was an assault on the senses, a deliberate attempt to short-circuit the rational mind. They would rig a warehouse or a community hall with tangled nests of wires, projectors casting chaotic films and liquid light shows onto every surface, and strobe lights flashing at disorienting frequencies. Sound was everywhere. Tapes of strange noises, people talking into microphones that would echo back with a 10-second delay, and live music. The house band for these strange carnivals was a local group that had just recently changed its name from the Warlocks. They were called the Grateful Dead. The acid tests were their crucible. They learned to play not for a passive audience, but for a room full of people whose perceptions of time, sound, and space were radically altered. They had to improvise, to stretch songs into long exploratory jams, to become a sonic guide for hundreds of people navigating inner space. The centerpiece of the evening, of course, was the acid itself. A large garbage can would be filled with electric blue Kool-Aid, into which an unknown but substantial quantity of Owsley Stanley LSD was poured. A sign would hang nearby. "Can you pass the acid test?" There was no pretense of therapy or spirituality in the hushed intellectual sense. This was LSD as a public utility, a catalyst for collective chaos and ecstatic communion. The pranksters had taken the genie that Leary had released to the masses and thrown it a massive, deafeningly loud party, from the secret labs of the CIA, through the hushed studies of intellectuals, to the lecture halls of Harvard and across the country in a painted bus. Lysergic acid diethylamide had completed its journey. It was now fully, irrevocably, and chaotically loose in the culture, fueling the music, the art, and the ethos of a generation that was about to collide head-on with the establishment that had, in its own secret way, started it all. The stage was set for a cultural civil war, and its flashpoint would be this strange, powerful, and now widely available little chemical. The substance had finally escaped the laboratory. It zipped out of the therapist's office, past the watchful eyes of the CIA, and poured into the streets. The genie released from a very small, very potent bottle. By 1966, it had found its true home, not in the quiet clinics of Los Angeles, or the sterile interrogation rooms of some forgotten black site, but in the vibrant, pulsing heart of a new kind of revolution. It settled in a small neighborhood in San Francisco, a place called Haight-Ashbury, and from there it began to change the color and the sound of the world. The air itself seemed to grow thick with possibility, shimmering with a strange new energy. This was where the drug, once a tool for psychiatrists and spies, became a sacrament. It became acid. The music was the first and most obvious change. It was as if a door had been kicked open in the collective consciousness of a generation of musicians. In England, 4 young men from Liverpool, who had built a global empire on charming, 3-minute pop songs about holding hands, were undergoing a profound transformation. The Beatles had first been introduced to LSD in '65, rather reluctantly by a dentist of all people, who spiked their coffee at a dinner party. The experience was chaotic, terrifying, and utterly revelatory. It fractured their perception of reality, and in doing so, it shattered the clean, simple structures of their music. By mid-'66, with the release of the album Revolver, the shift was undeniable. The tidy love songs were gone, replaced by something strange and new. The song Tomorrow Never Knows was the anthem of this new consciousness. John Lennon, his voice processed through a rotating Leslie speaker to sound like a distant, disembodied oracle, sang lyrics lifted directly from Timothy Leary's psychedelic interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. "Turn off your mind, relax and float downstream," he intoned, not as a suggestion, but as a direct instruction. The music behind him was a tapestry of backward tape loops, sitar drones, and a relentless hypnotic drumbeat. It wasn't a song to be listened to. It was a space to be inhabited, a simulation of the psychedelic state itself. This was music designed to be a vehicle for inner exploration. A year later, in mid-67, they released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album that served as the high watermark of this psychedelic aesthetic. It was a carnival of sound, a kaleidoscopic collage of vaudeville, Indian ragas, and studio wizardry. The title of one of its most famous tracks, "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds," was immediately and correctly interpreted as a thinly veiled acronym for the drug that inspired it. The lyrics spoke of newspaper taxis and looking-glass ties, of rocking horse people eating marshmallow pies. It was pure, childlike surrealism, a direct transcription of the visions that blossomed behind closed eyelids under the influence of lysergic acid diethylamide. The very structure of the album, conceived as a seamless performance by a fictional band, broke the mold of the standard long-playing record. It was a holistic experience, an invitation into a different world, and it became the definitive soundtrack for what would be known as the Summer of Love. Across the Atlantic, another musician was taking the sonic potential of the psychedelic experience even further. His name was Jimi Hendrix. While the Beatles used the recording studio as their laboratory, Hendrix used his guitar. He arrived in London in late 1966, a journeyman guitarist from Seattle who had honed his craft on the Chitlin circuit. But in his mind and through his fingers, the electric guitar was not just an instrument. It was a conduit for pure energy, a machine for painting with sound. Hendrix's music was a direct translation of the LSD experience into noise. He used feedback, distortion, and the wah-wah pedal not as effects, but as primary colors on his sonic palette. To listen to a song like Purple Haze or Are You Experienced was to feel the rush of sensory overload, the dissolution of boundaries, the feeling of synesthesia where one could, as he sang, kiss the sky. His guitar solos were not structured melodic lines. They were sprawling, elemental explorations. They screamed and wept and exploded. He was mapping a new territory of consciousness with 6 strings and an amplifier turned up to 10. When he performed at the Monterey International Pop Festival in June of 1967, the symbolic kickoff for the Summer of Love, he concluded his set by setting his guitar on fire. It was a ritual sacrifice, a piece of performance art that perfectly captured the feeling of the moment. Creation and destruction, beauty and violence, all wrapped up in a blazing psychedelic pyre. The message was clear. The old world, with its old rules and its old sounds, was being burned away to make room for something new. This new aesthetic bled from the ears to the eyes. The visual art of the era became a mirror of the psychedelic mind. Posters for concerts at venues like the Fillmore in San Francisco featured swirling, melting fonts that were nearly impossible to read, their letters contorting like living things. The colors were vibrating, fluorescent and clashing, designed to simulate the enhanced sensory perception of an acid trip. The artist Peter Max became a superstar of the form, his cosmic art adorning everything from posters to bedsheets. His work was a joyful explosion of bold lines and day-glow colors, depicting serene, stargazing figures floating through celestial dreamscapes. It was optimistic, spiritual, and deeply commercial, capturing the utopian spirit of the counterculture and packaging it for mass consumption. The art, the music, the fashion, it all coalesced into a unified aesthetic. It was a culture that advertised its own altered state. The long hair, the flowing clothes, the beads, the paisley patterns. It was a uniform that signaled a rejection of the grey, conformist world of their parents and an allegiance to this new, colourful internal frontier. The promise of LSD, as articulated by its prophets like Leary, was not just recreational, it was revolutionary. It was a tool for dismantling the ego, for seeing past the artificial constructs of society, the government, the military, the corporation, and connecting with a deeper, more authentic, universal truth. To drop acid was to drop out of the system. It was a political act, a declaration of independence from a society they saw as sick, a society that was waging a brutal war in Vietnam while demanding rigid conformity at home. The Summer of Love in 1967 saw as many as 100,000 young people from all over America converge on Haight-Ashbury, seeking to build a new world based on peace, love, and shared consciousness. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as if a chemical compound discovered by accident in a Swiss laboratory might actually change the world. But of course, a light that burns so brightly cannot burn for long, and the shadows it casts can be very dark indeed. While the children of Haight-Ashbury were weaving flowers in their hair, the world outside their psychedelic bubble was watching with a mixture of confusion, fascination, and growing horror. The utopian dream, so vivid and real inside the trip, began to look like a dangerous nightmare to mainstream America. The media, which had initially treated the hippie phenomenon as a quirky human interest story, began to change its tone. The narrative shifted from one of peaceful flower children to one of delusional, drug-addled dropouts. Sensationalist stories began to fill the newspapers and television reports, tales of bad trips that ended not in enlightenment, but in psychosis. Urban legends spread like wildfire. There were stories of young people who had taken LSD and stared at the sun until they went blind, convinced they were gazing into the face of God. There were tales of students who, under the influence, believed they could fly and stepped out of high-rise windows to their deaths. Perhaps the most famous and damaging story was that of Art Linkletter's daughter, Diane, who committed suicide in 1969. Linkletter, a popular television host and a symbol of wholesome family values, immediately and very publicly blamed LSD for her death, claiming she had been having a bad trip. Though a later autopsy found no trace of the drug in her system, the story stuck. It provided a face, a tragic and relatable victim for the growing moral panic. The media narrative painted a terrifying picture. LSD wasn't just a drug. It was a chemical that could cause permanent insanity. It could damage your chromosomes, leading to birth defects in your children. It could trigger latent mental illness, opening a door in the mind that could never be closed. Again, while some of these fears had a grain of truth, the drug could indeed trigger psychotic breaks in vulnerable individuals. The coverage was overwhelmingly hysterical, divorced from the nuance of the actual scientific research that was still, at that point, being conducted. The government, which had been monitoring the spread of the drug with increasing alarm, saw its opportunity to act. The psychedelic counterculture, with its anti-war protests and its fundamental rejection of American materialism, was already seen as a threat to social order. The drug that fueled it became an easy target. It was far simpler to legislate against a chemical than it was to address the deep social and political anxieties that were driving young people to use it in the first place. The backlash began in earnest at the state level. In mid-66, California, the epicenter of the movement, became the first state to make LSD illegal. Other states quickly followed suit, but the real goal was a federal ban. The political rhetoric intensified. Politicians spoke of an epidemic of drug abuse that was corrupting the nation's youth, undermining their moral fiber, and threatening the very foundations of the country. They weren't entirely wrong about the scale of use. By 1967, millions of doses of LSD were in circulation, but their framing of the issue was one of pure pathology. There was no room for the idea that these users might be seeking spiritual insight or genuine personal growth. They were simply deviants, casualties of a dangerous new plague. In Washington, D.C., lawmakers held hearings where they trotted out a parade of horrified parents and so-called medical experts who painted the bleakest possible picture of the drug's effects. The few researchers who tried to offer a more balanced perspective, who spoke of the drug's potential therapeutic benefits in controlled settings, were drowned out by the chorus of alarm. The momentum was unstoppable. The complex reality of the psychedelic experience was flattened into a simple, terrifying caricature. Take this drug and you will lose your mind. The legislative hammer finally fell in '68 as part of a larger omnibus bill, the Staggers-Dodd Bill, officially an amendment to the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act, made the possession of LSD a felony. This was a significant escalation from earlier laws that had only targeted manufacturing and sales. Now the user themselves was a criminal. President Lyndon B. Johnson, a man already besieged by an unpopular war and widespread social unrest, signed the bill into law. The same year, the federal government officially shut down all sanctioned research into the therapeutic potential of LSD. The door was slammed shut. The substance was designated a Schedule Y drug, a category reserved for substances with a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. It was placed in the same legal box as heroin. The journey of LSD, from a promising psychiatric tool to the sacrament of a counterculture, had reached its final official destination, a public menace. The summer of love was over, replaced by an autumn of arrests and a long, cold winter of prohibition. The very thing that was supposed to liberate the mind was now something that could put your body in a cage. The irony was lost on no one, least of all the people who now had to take their spiritual journeys in the shadows, as fugitives from the law. And all the while this public drama was unfolding, another quieter story was reaching its own conclusion in the beige-walled corridors of Langley, Virginia. While the public was being told that LSD was a terrifyingly powerful tool for scrambling the mind, the Central Intelligence Agency was coming to the opposite conclusion. For them, the problem with LSD wasn't that it was too effective. It was that it was not effective at all. Not for their purposes, anyway. The grand ambition of MK Ultra, the search for a key that could unlock and control the human mind, had run headlong into the chaotic, unpredictable, and fiercely personal nature of the psychedelic experience. The program, which had begun with such high hopes in the early 50s, was sputtering to a messy and deeply disappointing end. The agency had spent 2 decades and millions of dollars chasing a ghost. They had dosed their own agents, unsuspecting civilians, prisoners, and mental patients. They had conducted thousands of experiments, all in pursuit of a simple goal: to find a reliable way to make people do things against their will. They wanted a truth serum that would make a captured spy reveal his secrets. They wanted a disorientation agent that could be used to incapacitate an enemy. Most ambitiously, they dreamed of a compound that could be used to program a human being, to create a real-life Manchurian candidate who could be triggered to carry out an assassination and have no memory of it afterward. LSD, with its profound psychological effects, had seemed like the most promising candidate, but the results were, to put it mildly, a disaster. The drug simply refused to behave. Instead of making subjects compliant and suggestible, it often did the exact opposite. Some subjects became intensely paranoid, convinced their interrogators were demons or monsters, and would retreat into a shell of absolute silence, their secrets locked away more securely than ever. Others would dissolve into fits of uncontrollable laughter at the sheer absurdity of the situation. Many would simply start talking, but what came out was not a stream of classified information, but a torrent of free associative nonsense, a chaotic jumble of childhood memories, cosmic philosophy, and detailed descriptions of the patterns melting on the ceiling tiles, an interrogator trying to extract truth. Movements would instead be treated to a 10-minute monologue on the interconnectedness of all living things, followed by a tearful confession about a stolen bicycle from 3rd grade. The core problem, the CIA's researchers slowly and grudgingly came to realize, was the utter subjectivity of the experience. The drug didn't impose a new reality. It shattered the existing one and forced the user to build a new one out of the raw material of their own psyche. Their memories, their fears, and their hopes. The outcome was critically dependent on what psychologists called setting, the mindset of the individual and the environment in which the drug was taken. An agent trying to conduct a hostile interrogation was providing the worst possible setting. The fear and paranoia inherent in the situation would inevitably amplify the negative potential of the drug, leading to the dreaded bad trip. There was no way to standardize the experience, no way to guarantee a specific outcome. For every one subject who might become pliable, there were 10 who had become hysterical, catatonic, or simply lost in their own inner universe. The dream of a mind control weapon was dissolving into a puddle of psychedelic goo. The agency, in its quest for a perfect truth serum, had instead found a perfect chaos agent, a substance that didn't unlock secrets so much as it simply changed the shape of the keyhole. By the late 60s, the writing was on the wall. The internal memos from the technical services staff became increasingly pessimistic. The program was producing no actionable intelligence. It was a logistical and ethical nightmare. The risk of public exposure was growing, especially as stories of the drug's use in the counterculture began to spread. What if a journalist connected the hippies in San Francisco with the secret experiments being run out of a safe house just a few miles away? The potential for a scandal of catastrophic proportions was immense. The scientists, who had once been true believers in the project, quietly moved on to other, less exotic forms of intelligence work. The funding began to dry up. The entire enterprise, once seen as the cutting edge of Cold War spycraft, now seemed like a foolish and embarrassing dead end. The final quiet death of MKUltra came in 1973. The political climate in Washington had shifted dramatically. The Watergate scandal was exploding, and a new mood of suspicion was directed toward the intelligence agencies. The Church Committee, a Senate Select Committee led by Senator Frank Church, was beginning to form, tasked with investigating abuses by the CIA, NSA, and FBI. The director of the CIA at the time was Richard Helms, a man who had been with the agency since its inception and was deeply involved in its darkest secrets, including MKUltra. Helms saw the storm clouds gathering. He knew that the MKUltra files, with their dry, bureaucratic descriptions of profoundly unethical human experiments, were a ticking time bomb. If those documents ever saw the light of day, the fallout would be devastating. So, in an act of preemptive damage control, he gave a simple, chilling order: destroy the records. The vast majority of the paperwork detailing 2 decades of research into mind control, the experiment logs, the financial records, the reports on human subjects, was gathered up, stuffed into shredders, and burned. It was a desperate attempt to erase a chapter of history, to pretend that this grotesque search for the levers of the human soul had never happened. The program was officially terminated. There was no grand ceremony, no final report declaring success or failure. It simply ceased to be. The great quest for mind control had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of an office paper shredder, a silent admission that, after all the money, all the effort, and all the human cost, they had found nothing. The mind, it turned out, was not a lock to be picked. It was a universe unto itself. And LSD wasn't a key, but just another reminder of how vast and how mysterious that universe truly was. The year is 1974. A cold December wind blows through the canyons of Manhattan, carrying with it the front page of the New York Times. And on that front page, a story by an investigative reporter named Seymour Hersh. The headline is unassuming, but its contents are a lit match tossed into a warehouse of dry tinder. The story alleges with unnerving confidence that the Central Intelligence Agency, an organization forbidden by its own charter from operating within the United States, has been conducting a massive illegal domestic spying operation against the anti-war movement and other dissident groups. The public, already raw and cynical from the slow, agonizing bleed of the Watergate scandal, looks up from its morning coffee. The story lands not like a revelation, but like a confirmation of the darkest whispers, the most paranoid fears. It seems the watchmen have not been watching the walls, but have been peering back through our own windows. In the halls of Congress, this was more than just a scandal. It was an institutional crisis. The carefully constructed post-war consensus, the quiet agreement that the nation's intelligence agencies must be given a free hand to fight the Cold War, was shattering. The beast in the basement, the one nobody was supposed to talk about, was now rattling its chains, and the noise was deafening. And so, in the first months of 1975, the United States Senate convened a special committee. Its official title was the U.S. Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities. A mouthful, a suitably bureaucratic and uninteresting name for what was about to become the most profound public inquest into the secret heart of American power. The world would come to know it by the name of its chairman, a thoughtful, deliberate, and deeply troubled senator from Idaho, Frank Church. The Church Committee was not designed for vengeance. Frank Church himself was a product of the establishment, a man who believed in the necessity of a strong intelligence service. He was not a firebrand. He was a caretaker, hoping to prune the dead branches to save the tree. But as the hearings began, as the witnesses were sworn in, as the first trickles of classified documents were declassified and delivered in sealed briefcases, the committee realized they were not dealing with a few dead branches. They were standing before a forest of rot. The committee's staff, a collection of young, ambitious lawyers and investigators, began their work in a state of controlled disbelief. They sent out requests for documents. They summoned witnesses, and they began to hear whispers of a program so bizarre, so profoundly unethical, that it sounded like fiction. It had a strange clinical name, a code name, MKUltra. When they asked the CIA for the files, they were met with a calm, bureaucratic stonewalling. The files, they were told, simply didn't exist. For a time, it seemed like a dead end, a ghost story told by disgruntled former agents. The breakthrough came from the unlikeliest of places, the budget office. An investigator, wading through mountains of arcane financial records, noticed a set of strange budgetary discrepancies from the 1950s and 60s. Funds had been routed from one obscure project to another, ending up in accounts for something called MKUltra. The money trail was there, undeniable. It was the fossilized footprint of a dinosaur. With this proof, the committee pressed harder, and the CIA's new director, William Colby, a man tasked with cleaning a house he had not built, found himself in an impossible position. He knew that what the committee was looking for was real. He also knew that his predecessor, Richard Helms, had done something extraordinary to hide it. In '73, as the Watergate storm clouds gathered, and it seemed that all government secrets might be torn open for public inspection, CIA Director Richard Helms had made a fateful decision. He was a man of the old school, a creature of the clandestine world, who believed that the CIA's secrets must be protected at all costs, not from enemies abroad, but from the prying eyes of the American public and its elected representatives. He believed he was protecting the institution, and so he gave the order, destroy everything. Destroy all records pertaining to MKUltra. The logistics of this destruction are a quiet horror story in themselves. It was not a bonfire in the backyard. It was a systematic administrative purge. Across the agency, clerks and officers received the directive. They went to the filing cabinets, to the vaults where the history of the program was stored. They pulled the folders, thousands upon thousands of them. They fed them page by page into shredders. They burned them in secure incinerators. Years of research, of operational reports, of receipts from brothels in San Francisco, and medical charts of unwitting American citizens, of psychological profiles, of agonizing failures and chilling successes, all of it turned to ash and confetti. Helms would later testify, with a chilling lack of remorse, that he had not wanted this material to be misunderstood, a masterpiece of understatement. He had ordered the memory of the program to be erased from the official record, a preemptive lobotomy on the agency itself. But the eraser was not perfect. Nothing ever is. The financial records survived, a ghost in the machine, and by a sheer accident of bureaucracy, a box of files had been misfiled, sent to the wrong archive, and forgotten. Some 8,000 pages. They were found in 1977, 2 years after the committee had published its final report, a final horrifying postscript. But even in '75, the Church Committee had enough. They had the money trail. They had the testimony of former operatives, men like Sidney Gottlieb, who appeared before them, his face a mask of weary regret. They had the families of the victims, who were just beginning to understand what had happened to their loved ones. The picture that emerged in the hushed, televised hearing room was grotesque. The committee revealed to a stunned nation that their own government had, for 2 decades, conducted a vast secret program to find ways to control the human mind. They had used hypnosis, electroshock, sensory deprivation, and most famously, lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. They had administered these things to American citizens without their knowledge or consent. They tested them on prisoners, on mental patients, on drug addicts, on prostitutes. They set up front companies, like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, to funnel money to university researchers who had no idea their patron was the CIA. They established safe houses in New York and San Francisco, apartments with one-way mirrors and recording equipment, where agents could watch the effects of LSD on unsuspecting men lured there by prostitutes. The scale of it was staggering. 149 sub-projects, 80 institutions, including 44 universities and colleges, 12 hospitals and 3 prisons, and a cast of characters that seemed pulled from a pulp spy novel, CIA chemists, mobsters, academics, magicians. The project's goal, stated in dry bureaucratic language, was to study the manipulation of human behavior. The reality was a sordid, chaotic, and often farcical search for a magic bullet, a truth serum, an amnesia drug, a way to create a programmable assassin, a Manchurian candidate. For the American public watching these proceedings, the revelation of MKUltra was the final devastating blow to a crumbling faith. The CIA was not just spying on activists, It had been using its own people as guinea pigs in a deranged science experiment. The scandal was immense. It dominated the headlines for months. It confirmed the wildest conspiracy theories and created a dozen new ones. The idea that a shadowy agency could operate so far outside the law, with so little oversight, and with such profound contempt for the citizens it was meant to protect, became deeply embedded in the national consciousness. Frank Church, the reluctant inquisitor, had opened a door, and behind it was a room filled with the country's worst nightmares. The committee's final report was a damning indictment, a formal record of a secret history that had been playing out just beneath the surface of American life for a generation. The secrets were out, but the ghosts of the program were only just beginning to stir. The echoes of the Church Committee's hearings did not fade with the evening news. They reverberated through courtrooms and family homes for decades to come. The final reports were published, bound in grim government blue covers. But for the victims and their families, the story was a raw, open wound. The official narrative, however shocking, was an abstraction. It was data points, project numbers, and redacted names. The reality was a collection of individual lives shattered by a program they never even knew existed. And so began the slow, arduous, and deeply painful process of seeking accountability, a battle fought not in secret safe houses, but in the slow, grinding machinery of the American legal system. Perhaps no story illustrates this aftermath more poignantly than that of the Olson family. For 22 years, the family of Frank Olson, the army biochemist who fell from the window of the Statler Hotel in New York City, had lived with a simple, tragic story. They were told he had suffered a nervous breakdown, that he had jumped. It was a private grief, a family tragedy. But in mid-75, they sat, like the rest of America, and watched the Church Committee hearings. And they heard the testimony about an unnamed scientist who had been given LSD without his knowledge and had plunged to his death 9 days later. The details were sparse, but for the Olson family, they were a perfect match. The private tragedy was suddenly, horrifically public. The government, facing a public relations nightmare, could no longer maintain the cover story. President Gerald Ford invited the Olson family to the White House. He offered a formal apology. The CIA director, William Colby, gave them a file of heavily redacted documents related to the case. It was a surreal moment, the highest office in the land apologizing for a secret assassination carried out by its own intelligence agency. The government offered a settlement, $750,000. It was a significant sum designed to close the book, to cauterize the wound. The Olsons accepted. For a time, it seemed like a form of closure, but it wasn't. The documents, even redacted, hinted at a darker story. Frank Olson wasn't just an unwitting victim of a drug test gone wrong. He was a high-level scientist at Fort Detrick, deeply involved in the military's most secret biological warfare programs. He had developed moral qualms. He had wanted to resign. His sons, Eric and Niels, spent the next several decades of their lives on a relentless quest for the full story. They came to believe that their father's death was not a drug-induced suicide, but a calculated murder, an execution staged to look like an accident, to silence a man who knew too much and was about to talk. They had his body exhumed in 1994. The forensic evidence was inconclusive but suggestive. The family filed a new lawsuit in 2012, not for money, but for documents, for the truth. The suit was ultimately dismissed, the court ruling that the 1976 settlement had resolved the matter. The book, legally speaking, was closed, but for the family and for the public record, the question still hangs in the air, a testament to the fact that some secrets once kept are never fully brought into the light. The Olson case was the most famous, but it was far from the only one. The revelations opened a floodgate. There was the family of Harold Blauer, a professional tennis player who had died in '53 at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. He had checked in seeking treatment for depression. He was told he was being given a new cocktail of drugs. In reality, he was an unwitting subject in an army-funded experiment to test a powerful hallucinogen, a derivative of mescaline. He was given 5 massive injections in secret. After the final one, he went into convulsions and died. For 22 years, his family was told he had died of a pre-existing heart condition. The Church Committee uncovered the truth. The government settled with his estate out of court. There was Stanley Glickman, a struggling artist in Paris, who was lured to a cafe in 1952 by a man who was, in fact, a CIA agent. His coffee was spiked with LSD. The experience was terrifying. Glickman descended into a year-long psychosis, his life and career destroyed. He sued the government, and after a long legal battle, a judge awarded him a settlement, acknowledging the profound damage done. And there were countless others, the unknown victims, the people who were dosed and simply wandered off into the margins of society, their lives derailed by an experience they could never understand. The mental patients who were already vulnerable, whose reports of bizarre psychological torture were dismissed as symptoms of their illness. Their stories are lost, buried in the shredded files and the quiet complicity of time. This legacy of ruined lives was paralleled by a broader, more insidious legacy, a profound and lasting corrosion of public trust. The revelations of MK-Ultra, alongside COINTELPRO and the illegal domestic spying, created a deep schism between the American people and their intelligence agencies. The agencies were no longer seen as benign protectors, but as something darker, more unaccountable, a shadow government operating by its own rules. This wasn't just liberal paranoia, it became a mainstream belief. The phrase, "I don't trust the government," shifted from the rhetoric of the fringe to a common sentiment expressed around the dinner table. This mistrust became a permanent feature of the American political landscape. It fueled conspiracy theories, some plausible, some outlandish. It made the necessary work of intelligence gathering infinitely more difficult. Every new revelation of government surveillance, from the NSA's wiretapping programs to the vast data collection of the digital age, is now viewed through the lens of MK-Ultra. The question is always there, what else are they not telling us? The program officially ended in the 1970s, but its philosophical poison continues to seep into the groundwater of the national psyche. It taught a generation a terrible lesson, that your own government could view you not as a citizen to be protected, but as a resource to be exploited, a test subject in a laboratory of control. It is a hard lesson to unlearn, the quiet hum of suspicion, the assumption of bad faith, the belief that there is always another, darker secret waiting to be uncovered. That is the true, enduring legacy of MK-Ultra, a legacy of shadows and whispers, and the gnawing uncertainty of what might still be hidden from view. And yet, the story of this strange, powerful molecule does not end in a hearing room or a courtroom, or in the yellowed pages of a conspiracy theory newsletter. For decades after the fall of MK-Ultra and the implosion of the 1960s counterculture, LSD and its chemical cousins went into a deep and profound hibernation. They were banished, driven from the laboratories, forbidden from clinical practice. The very idea of psychedelic research became toxic, the career-ending obsession of a few fringe academics. The substance that had once been hailed by some as a key to unlocking the mysteries of the mind, and by others as a weapon to control it, was now simply a Schedule I-controlled substance, the most dangerous category. No accepted medical use, high potential for abuse. The door that Aldous Huxley had written about was not just closed. It was sealed, barricaded, and marked with a biohazard sign. But history, like consciousness itself, is a fluid and unpredictable thing. While the molecule was in exile, the world changed. The tools of science grew infinitely more sophisticated. Brain imaging technologies like fMRI and PET scans were developed, allowing us to watch the living brain in action, to see the intricate dance of neural networks. At the same time, the field of psychiatry, for all its advances with SSRIs and other pharmaceuticals, began to run up against the hard limits of its existing toolkit. For conditions like severe, treatment-resistant depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the profound existential anxiety that often accompanies a terminal illness, the available treatments were often inadequate, the suffering was immense, and the need for a new approach was becoming desperately clear. Slowly, cautiously, a few dedicated researchers began the painstaking work of bringing psychedelics back from the wilderness. This was not a movement of Timothy Leary's disciples, urging the world to turn on, tune in, drop out. It was a movement of credentialed serious scientists, navigating a labyrinth of regulatory hurdles with methodical patience. A key figure in this quiet renaissance was Rick Doblin, who, in mid-86, founded an organization with a determinedly sober and academic name, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS. For decades, MAPS operated on the fringes, raising money through donations, funding small-scale studies and persistently lobbying regulatory bodies like the FDA for permission to conduct legitimate clinical research. Their strategy was the polar opposite of the 1960s. It was not about cultural revolution. It was about data, hard, quantifiable, peer-reviewed data. By the early 2000s, the climate began to shift. The first modern, rigorously controlled studies began to appear, emerging from some of the world's most prestigious research institutions: Johns Hopkins University, New York University, Imperial College London, UCLA. These were not the haphazard, ethically bankrupt experiments of the MKUltra era. The contrast could not be more stark. The CIA's safe houses were replaced by comfortable, carefully designed clinical rooms with soft lighting, curated music, and comfortable furniture. The clandestine dosing of unsuspecting victims was replaced by a meticulous screening process, enrolling volunteers who gave fully informed consent. The goal was not control, but healing. The protocols themselves were a testament to this new therapeutic approach. A participant in a modern psilocybin or LSD study does not simply take a pill and get sent on their way. The process is embedded in a deep framework of psychotherapy. There are weeks of preparation with trained therapists, building trust and setting intentions. The psychedelic session itself, which can last for 6 to 8 hours, is supervised by 2 guides at all times. The participants are encouraged to lie down, wear an eye mask, listen to a specially designed music program, and turn their attention inward. The drug is not the treatment itself. It is a catalyst for a profound psychological experience, which is then processed and integrated in subsequent therapy sessions over weeks and months. It is a tool to make therapy more effective, to open a window in the mind that allows for new perspectives and deep emotional processing. And the results, published in top-tier scientific journals, have been nothing short of remarkable. Studies at Johns Hopkins and NYU found that a single high dose of psilocybin, the active compound in magic mushrooms, when combined with psychotherapy, produced rapid, substantial, and sustained decreases in anxiety and depression in patients with life-threatening cancer diagnoses. For individuals facing their own mortality, the experience often provided a sense of peace, of interconnectedness, of acceptance that had been utterly elusive. It did not cure their cancer, but it profoundly changed their experience of dying. At the same time, MAPS has been pioneering research into the use of MDMA, a psychedelic-like substance often known as ecstasy, for the treatment of severe, chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. Their trials are focused heavily on military veterans and first responders, individuals whose trauma is so deeply entrenched that traditional therapies have failed. The results have been so successful that the FDA has granted it breakthrough therapy status, fast-tracking it toward potential approval as a prescription medicine. The irony is almost too perfect to be real. The very conditions of psychological torment that the military intelligence complex helped to create and exacerbate are now being treated by the careful, therapeutic application of substances that the CIA once tried to weaponize. The story of LSD, it seems, has come full circle. The chemical that Albert Hofmann accidentally discovered in his Basel laboratory, the substance that held such promise for understanding consciousness, that was twisted into a tool of clandestine warfare, and then became a sacrament for a generation, has returned. It has come back not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a brain scanner, the soft-spoken guidance of a therapist, the sterile precision of a clinical trial. The psychedelic renaissance is not a repeat of the 1960s. It is something new. It is a slow, methodical re-evaluation of a set of molecules that we have misunderstood, misused, and feared for over half a century. The work is still in its early stages. The questions and challenges are immense. But for the first time in a very long time, the conversation is being driven not by spies or gurus, but by scientists and healers. The secret history is being overwritten by a new chapter, one that holds the quiet, tentative promise that this strange key, once used to try and lock the mind, might just in the right hands be used to set it free.